Good morning, students of the Jamaica School of Preaching and Biblical Studies, and good morning to all the viewers in the internet. I'm grateful to God for giving us another day that we can draw closer to Him in the study of important topics in the course called Introduction to Biblical Apologetics. This time we're going to be going to God in prayer. Father in heaven, I give you thanks for a new day. Thanks for your healing power on me. Thank you, O Lord, for granting health to all of us, and give us a mind that is eager to learn and a heart that has a great desire to do your will. We pray especially for all those who are not believers in you, who don't believe that you exist, or who do not respect you and do not have the intention of doing what you want. Pray that this course in biblical apologetics may be used by you to bring them to a genuine faith in your existence, a love for you that will drive them to want to do whatever it is you have commanded them to do. And may you equip all of us as Christians, disciples of Christ, with the knowledge and the skill that we may be able to persuade a lot of people to receive Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. We pray that you may be with us now as we enter into a period of time of trying to remember what we have learned, that each person will do well. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, before I go any further, I want to make sure that you have all signed and registered. So, here's 3, and here's 4. This is for year 4. Yes. And year 3.
So you get last time.
Okay.
Well, Mars and I were not through reading.
Yes.
That's interesting.
What did you say?
It's interesting.
Okay, yes. I could have gone in more detail, but I just wanted to give an overall simple idea of the other side of the coin. Yes. There's a lot more involved in that. That's the skeleton.
I love the information because
Yeah.
I don't want, when I end up somewhere ready to teach something,
Yeah.
I'm teaching fast stuff.
Yeah. Learning about what God means in the Bible is a lifelong study. When I thought that I would finish discovering everything, that I would know and understand what is the correct answer to every question, I'm still up to this point in time learning new things. Okay, so it's a lifelong thing, asking God for wisdom and honestly searching the scriptures and trying to ask God to help you put everything together to know what the right conclusion is. Okay, now we begin with a time of examination. I'm going to hand out papers to those that are here at the School of Preaching. If you want to get your paper at home or in your office, wherever you are, might even be on the airplane that you are, you can take out a piece of paper, a sheet of paper, and see if you can answer these questions. Is there anyone who needs a sheet of paper?
Okay.
Okay. Now these are the questions. I hope you can see them clearly. So you're to answer these 5 questions. Your answer does not need to be long. It's not an essay type of answer. It's a short answer for each question, and do your best. I'm going to be giving you an hour. If you finish before the hour, that's fine. I'll give you an hour so you can feel comfortable in answering the questions.
Does the answer?
If you want. Or you can write the question if you want.
Does the answer? Answer on me? No idea.
It actually answers all the
Okay, you can write your answers if you wish. But if you want to go ahead and write the question, that might help you more in the long
later
run
on.
when you know what you have answered. You have adequate time, an hour is supposed to be adequate. Anybody else who can make me another sheet of paper? Could you raise your hand? Maybe another sheet. Is anyone still working? If you raise your hand, if you're still working. All right, everyone is finished. So we're going to continue. We're going to end 10 minutes earlier so you can have a break before people. But first of all, we're going to be going through this test to see the essential points that should be there. If you don't have exactly the same thing I have, don't be alarmed. There are different ways of answering a question, so long as you have the essential ideas. Okay, so we're looking at a discussion now of what we just did. What do evolutionists think a layer of rock means? Well, it means a period of time. The lowest rock is to represent the earliest period of time, and the latest rock, or the most recent rock, layer of rock, is to represent later times, like our time. That's how they interpret it. Number two, or before I go on to number two, any comments on number one? Okay, number two, why do evolutionists think that a fossil is in the wrong layer of rock? Well, the essential point is the fossil is believed by evolutionists to belong to a different period of time. So, if, for example, they see simple organisms that they have placed in the earliest period of time, they are looking for that in the earliest layer of rock, the bottom rock. That's what they're looking for. But if they find it in a more recent rock, nearer to our time, they would think this fossil is out of place and try to give explanations as to how it came to be out of place. Because everything must fit in with their evolutionary worldview or interpretation. Not that it is actually in the wrong place, but the evolutionist is always trying to fit the information within his evolutionary perspective. Number three, numerous, quote, fossil graveyards, end of quote, have been found all over the world. How do these fossil graveyards prove that animals and plants, which were thought by evolutionists to be from different periods of time, actually lived at the same period of time? The basic answer is the animals and plants are mixed up together in the same place. Now, what the evolutionist is thinking is that you should not have the fishes in the same layer that you have amphibians, because they think that the fishes evolved into amphibians, animals that can live in the sea and on the dry land. Amphibians in the same place as they see chimpanzee, they know they're not supposed to be in the same place because the amphibians were earlier in the evolution of life. But when you have all of these different creatures that were thought to have evolved into other creatures, into other creatures, all mixed up together in the same place, wrong with the view that one form of life evolved into another form of life. So the animals and plants are mixed up together in the same place, in the same grave. They die together. Number 4, what do the perfect state of the preservation of fossils, animal tracks, ripple marks like water moving, and raindrop marks, that's amazing, teach about the time it took for these things to be buried and turned into rock. Let's face it. It is difficult to imagine how raindrop marks could be preserved unless there was an immediate and rapid burial of it. And the impression was made in the mud. Such a lot of rain was falling that the impression was made in the mud, and the mud hardened up, got additional minerals to turn it into rock. Ordinarily, even today, raindrop marks are not preserved. They evaporate and disappear. So, the answer is the animals were buried and turned into rock quickly. Everything happened quickly, not slow. Number 5, some layers of rock are very bent. Remember the picture of a huge rock that was bent over like this, yet there was no crack in it, no sign of having melted because of great heat. Well, what does that prove? It proves that the sediments were soft at the beginning. It wasn't hard, they were soft. Also that it was being moved by a lot of water. Okay, any questions or comments before I leave this test? Okay, let us move on. We're looking now at the next lesson that I did not get to complete last week. The lesson that I taught before this one was lesson 12 on the similarities in the body parts and the DNA of chimpanzees and human beings. We saw that the chimpanzee has 2 eyes, they have 2 ears, 1 mouth, 1 nose, 1 tongue, teeth, 2 hands, 2 legs. Some may think that they look really similar to a human being, more than any other animal that there is. An evolutionist called chimpanzees our closest relative. And molecular biologists who study DNA have claimed that 98% to 99% of chimpanzee DNA are just like our own. And so they have concluded that both chimps and humans evolved from one and the same ancestor who had features of chimps and humans in themselves. But then we saw that later analysis of DNA, when everything was looked at in all the DNA of chimps and all the DNA of humans, the first decade of 2000, they found that the similarities were not as great as previously thought. That at the most, there are 87% similarities between chimps and humans, at the least about 70% similarities. And we saw that similarity in itself does not prove that there was an evolution from a common ancestor, but it proves that there is common design used by one creator, and that is God. Now we're looking at a similar argument, similarities of human and animal embryos. Now, the general objectives are to examine the similarities between human and animal embryos. Before I move any further, can somebody tell me what is an embryo? How would you put it in your own words? When a person speaks about an embryo, let us say a human embryo, what are we talking about? Okay, you're talking about the earliest stage in the development of a human being. Right now in the Parliament, right now as I speak, starting from January 30th this week, that is Wednesday of this week, there have been different presentations made by Christian organizations and Christian individuals making a case to convince the Jamaican government that they should not change the law that forbids abortion, but keep it. And I have looked during this week at videos about abortion. And so you see the little body, and most often not the whole body, but parts of the body being taken out of the mother's womb. You don't have a strong stomach, don't watch it. It is sickening. So an embryo is an early stage in the development of a human being. So that's what we're looking at. The early stage of development, not only of us, but of different kinds of animals. So we're looking at the similarities between human and animal embryos. Number two, to examine the similarities between human and animal embryos as alleged proof. I use the word deliberately, alleged. Alleged means it has not been proven, even though some people think it has. Alleged proof that human beings evolved from the fish and the ancestor of the apes and humans. Number three, to examine if the similarities between human and animal embryos were real or a deception by Ernst Haeckel in the late 1860s. He was an evolutionist, lived at the time of Charles Darwin, and he was an artist, and he made certain prints of different embryos, like fish embryos, sun embryos, turtle embryos, rabbit embryos, and human embryos, and he deliberately made them look almost identical. And that's what I'm dealing with. Number four, to examine why the similarities between human and animal embryos are being taught in schools, even though it has been shown to be a fraud. That is, it is not true. Number five, to examine what some similar features between human and animal embryos prove, based on evidence from Genesis chapter 1. In lesson number 14, these are the general objectives. We're dealing with junk DNA. Junk means something that is left over or something that is of no use anymore, and so you throw it away. Number one, to examine the meaning of DNA. Two, to examine the concept of junk DNA. Three, to examine how evolutionary scientists came up with the concept of junk DNA. And number four, to examine the findings of the 10 Code project. I'll soon explain what this represents when I get over that section. Going now to the specific objectives of lesson 13, similarities of human and animal embryos. Number one. At the end of this lesson, the students will have identified at least two similarities between human and animal embryos in the print of Ernst Haeckel, the German evolutionist, in the 1860s. Number two, at the end of this lesson, the students will have brought out at least two deductions that Ernst Haeckel, the German evolutionist in the late 1860s, wanted people to conclude from his print of the human and animal embryos. Number three, at the end of this lesson, the students will have looked at what some animal and human embryos really look like. Number four, at the end of this lesson, the students will discuss possible reasons evolutionists are still publishing. Could you turn off the light to see if it will make a difference? Viewers, I'm doing this experiment to see if you'll be able to see the print of the PowerPoint better on YouTube by turning off the light. Number four, at the end of this lesson, the students will discuss possible reasons evolutionists are still publishing Ernst Haeckel's print of similarities between human and animal embryos in school and university textbooks. Number five, at the end of this lesson, the students will discuss God's explanation of some similarities between human and some animal embryos as found in Genesis chapter 1. Specific objectives of lesson number 14, junk D.N.A. Number one, at the end of this lesson, the students will have defined junk D.N.A. Number two, at the end of this lesson, the students will have explained why evolutionists believe that most of the DNA is junk or leftovers. Number three, at the end of this lesson, the students will have explained three facts discovered by the ENCODE project, which prove that the DNA is not junk or leftovers. Two lessons that we're looking at today. Now, first of all, let me start from what the Bible teaches. God is the one and the same designer of all living things. Genesis chapter 1 teaches that God created vegetative life separately from living creatures that fly in the sky and that swim in the waters, and that land animals were created separately from human life. It does not teach that one form of life that was in the water evolved into life on land. It teaches that each form of life was created separately. Genesis chapter 1 does not teach that life began in water and evolved into land animals and humans. Each form of life was created to reproduce after their own kind, not to evolve into a different kind of life. Therefore, similarity of some embryos does not prove that all living things evolved from one ancestor, but it proves that all living things, including humans, were created by one and the same Creator, God. So that is the foundation of looking at the reason there are some similarities between different forms of life. There is one designer, and he used some of the same design in different forms of life that he created. It does not therefore mean that All forms of life evolved from one common ancestor. Now let us look at the print that Ernst Haeckel had made in the 1860s that fooled up the scientific community and the world for some time. You can look on the board now and see the pictures. Similarities between human and some animal embryos as printed by Ernst Haeckel in the late 1860s. Now this embryo on the left, is a fish. What Ernst Haeckel says was a fish embryo. This is a salamander embryo, turtle embryo, a bird embryo, a mammal embryo, and a human embryo. I want you to take a look at them. They look almost identical. There might be slight differences, but in the way that it is printed by Ernst Haeckel, if you didn't know better, you would think that they are either identical or almost identical. This is in the early stage of the embryo's development. This now is in the middle stage of embryo development. This is what the fish would look like, the salamander, the turtle, the bird, the mammal, and the human. And look at these. Look at these four. Look how they look so much alike. They look so much alike. What is Ernst Haeckel trying to make us think? That is showing how we would go. That even in the embryo, that early development of the living thing, it shows where we came from. That's what he's trying to show. This is the late embryo development. This is the fish, the salamander, this is the turtle, this is the bird, this is the mammal, and this is the human. Again, look at the similarity between the human and this mammal. I believe this is a rabbit embryo. Look at the similarity. And look at the similarity between the turtle, between the bird and the turtle. Okay, so, and look at the similarity between the salamander, kind of lizard, and the fish. So he's trying to make a point. The fish developed into a lizard. The lizard developed into a turtle. Then it goes into a bird. Then it develops into a rabbit. Then it develops into a human. I believe that is where he's going with these prints. That is what he did back in the 1860s. This is what school textbooks, university textbooks still have in print. Even though, as we are going to see shortly, it was shown to be a fraud. Now let us look at what similarities this man wanted us to look at. There are two similarities that I have taken out to illustrate. First of all is what is called gill slits. Now, on a fish, there are some slits on the side of the fish by its head that open and shut, open and shut. It extracts or takes out the oxygen from the water and it is put into the bloodstream. That is how it breathes. Now, Ernst Haeckel has drawn what he calls gill slits with all of these different embryos. In other words, he's saying to us, all creatures used to be fish. And the embryo shows this, that every form of life has gill slits when it is in its mother's womb. Let me show you the gill slits that you didn't perhaps observe. The gill slits Ernst Haeckel claims is right here. Right here. Gill slits, gill slits, gill slits, gill slits. So every one of them has gill slits, meaning, according to Haeckel's view, they used to be fish. And that's why you see them in its early development in the womb. Gill slits, which evolutionists claim to prove that all living things, including human beings, used to be fish breathing through gills under the water. The next thing I want you to notice is tails. Every single one of these embryos have tails. Look at that. Here is a tail, here is a tail, 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 tail. Well, this one is losing it. I don't see much of one, and this one I don't see any. But in their early development, Haeckel is showing everyone has a tail. Well, what is the point about tails? Which evolutionists claim to prove that fish evolved into amphibians, animals that can live both in water and on dry land, like tadpoles, which have tiny tails, and in their adult development become frogs. And amphibians evolved into reptiles like lizards, which have tails, and reptiles evolved into birds which have feathery tails, and birds evolved into mammals, like the ancestor of the apes and humans, which have tails, and the ancestor of the apes and humans evolved into both apes, which have tails, and human beings who have a tailbone. Have you ever heard that human beings have a tailbone? Okay, now let us see what the embryos really look like, what the human and animal embryos really look like. In the first row of prints of a fish embryo, a salamander embryo, a turtle embryo, a chicken embryo, a rabbit embryo, and a human embryo, Ernst Haeckel made them look almost the same. Look on the board here. They look almost the same. In the second row of prints of a fish embryo, a salamander embryo, a turtle embryo, a chicken embryo, a rabbit embryo, and a human embryo, look how they are different from each other. Class, look on the board. Look how different these are from the first row. These were printed by Ernst Haeckel to make people think that these embryos looked almost the same, when in reality this is how they look. And when you see it this way, you see that there are far more differences between them than you first thought. Up here you think they're almost the same. And this is what they actually look like. They are not really as identical as Ernst Haeckel wanted people to believe. Other scientists who are experts in the study of embryos, who lived at the time Haeckel lived, showed from the second row of prints that Ernst Haeckel was trying to deceive the world into believing that all embryos start out looking almost the same, and therefore all living things have one and the same ancestor. This is not the first time evolutionists have tried to fool the world. There have been many attempts, as we have seen from last trimester, of evolutionists trying to convince people, even by presenting the skull bones, to show that we evolved from the ancestor of apes and humans. They even go to the extent of making the bone look older than what it is, and gluing together pieces of a human skull and pieces of an ape skull. So that's what we have to face with, deception. Now let us really see what the gill slits and tails and the human embryo are. First I had put misunderstanding, and then it hit me. This was not any misunderstanding. This is what you call misinformation. So originally I had on this PowerPoint slide misunderstanding. It's really misinformation, deliberate falsification of information, trying to prove a point. Misinformation of gill slits and tails in the human embryo. Let's begin with the gill slits. Gill slits are not proof that human beings descended from fish in water. They later develop into the thymus gland in the neck, which helps to fight germs. They later develop into the parathyroid glands in the neck, which helps to keep calcium at the right level in the body. They later develop into the middle ear to help in hearing sounds. They are never used to take oxygen from the amniotic fluid, but the umbilical cord brings air into the body of the embryo. So they're not like fish extracting oxygen from the mother's amniotic fluid that surrounds the embryo. That's not what these pouches are for. They don't open and close like fish gill slits. They shouldn't even be called gill slits. They were given that name by evolutionary scientists who wanted to convince people that we have evolved from fish. What about the tails? Tails are not proof that human beings descended from the ancestor of the apes and humans. What looks like a tail is the end part of the developing backbone. So going back to the prints of the embryos, this is the correct human embryo. What might be mistaken as a tail here is really the backbone that is not fully developed. When it is fully developed, you don't see anything sticking out like that. It is not really a tail. Even the expression tailbone is not correct. Okay, so it's not a tail, it's the end part of the developing backbone. The information in the genes of human embryos does not have any instructions for the formation of a tail as the information in the genes of the ape embryos have. It is this information in the genes which keeps one kind of life different from other kinds of life, and which prevents one kind of life from changing into a completely different kind of life. Why does Ernst Haeckel's print of human and animal embryos still continue in biology textbooks? Not all evolutionists have abandoned Ernst Haeckel's proof of evolution from comparisons of the human and animal embryos. They say that enemies, notice what they say, they make them out to be enemies. Enemies of Haeckel, notice another word they use, allege. In other words, they haven't proven it, but they allege, they claim that his print of embryos was fraudulent, and that scientists who believe that God created everything have used this to their advantage. That's how they explain it away. Evolutionists have an agenda to try to convince students in the education system that there is no God and that evolution is the cause of everything in the universe coming into existence. Now, what is DNA? DNA is the software of life. This is what it looks like. It provides coded instructions for living things to survive, grow, and reproduce. Junk is that which has no use or no function. Evolutionists believe that there was not enough time for the whole sequence of DNA to evolve 3 billion coded letters. And so they theorize that most of the DNA would be junk, that is not having any function, and other evolutionists have a different explanation. They believe that most of the DNA used to have function, but now that the human being has evolved, most of the DNA would not presently have any function. These non-functional DNA are claimed to be leftovers from one's evolutionary past. In the 1970s, scientists discovered that only 3% of DNA have codes for making proteins. This confirmed for them the theory that most of the DNA would not have any function, since there was not enough time to evolve such a complex system of information storage, copying of information, and making different parts of the cell with proteins. The ENCODE project, which means Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, consisted of hundreds of scientists in dozens of labs around the world studying the DNA. The ENCODE project began in 2003 and ended in 2012. That is a period of 9 years. There are 3 facts which this project discovered about DNA. 1, 93% of DNA is functional, and this would likely go to 100% with further research. That is, 93% of what was called junk DNA actually has a function. The portion of DNA that do not code for proteins have 4 million switches that control when our genes turn on or off and how much protein they make. These not only affect all the cells and organs in our body, but they do this at different points in our lifetime. So to conclude, Ernst Haeckel, who was an artist and a supporter of the theory of evolution, deceived the scientific community into believing that the embryos of fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, rabbit, and human were similar. But experts in the study of embryos show that his drawings of human and animal embryos were false. Ernst Haeckel was trying to make the world believe that all embryos start out looking almost the same. Therefore, all living things have one and the same ancestor. Not really widely. Gill slits do not prove that human beings descended from fish in water, but the embryo gets its air from the umbilical cord, and the gill slits develop into the thymus gland in the neck, which helps to fight germs, the parathyroid glands in the neck, which helps to keep calcium at the right level in the body, and into the middle ear to help inherit sounds. Tail in the human embryo is not a tail, but it is the developing backbone. Finally, there is no junk DNA. The parts of the DNA that do not code for making proteins control when one gene is turned on or off and how much protein they make. The DNA did not evolve, but its complex design shows that an intelligent mind created it from the beginning, and it was not the result of random natural processes. This intelligent mind is God, the Creator, whose thoughts are very deep, and his understanding is infinite. Okay, so that is our lesson for today. And I'm glad that you were able to join from the internet, and also for the students who are in the school. God bless you all. Our next class is going to start in roughly about 10 minutes. at 11:30. At that time, we will be doing Introduction to Biblical Hebrew. At this time, the students are going to take a break. God bless you all. Internal.